All right, we are diving into some intense territory today, really intense. We're tackling How to Blow Up a Pipeline by Andreas Malm. And wow, this book, it doesn't mess around.
No kidding, it really doesn't. Malm, he comes out swinging. Right from the get-go, he contrasts the urgency, like the sheer massive urgency of this climate crisis that we're in with, well, frankly, the inaction of those in power. He even uses this phrase, the ruling classes are burning their way to the end, which kind of sets the stage for the whole book.
Yeah, I picked up on that too, that feeling. It's like he's saying they're fine with, fiddling while Rome burns.
Right, yeah.
But he connects that to like the real world consequences too.
Totally. He points to the investments that are still happening, right? Like tons of money pouring into fossil fuel infrastructure while like Siberia and the Amazon are literally on fire. So he's saying this gap between what we got to do and what's actually happening, it shows how unequipped they are, the ruling classes, to deal with this.
It's like their whole system's broken when it comes to this, right?
Yeah.
But okay, it's not all doom and gloom though. He does talk about the climate movement, and like we've seen a lot of energy, right? Especially with groups like Extinction Rebellion, some big mobilizations happening.
He acknowledges that for sure, especially groups like Ende Gelände in Germany. They've done some pretty amazing stuff, disrupting coal production with these huge demonstrations. Thousands of activists, he describes, wearing white coveralls, just swarming these open pit coal mines and bringing everything to a standstill.
Yeah.
It's kind of wild, actually.
Powerful imagery, for sure.
Yeah.
And he seems really struck by their ability to, break through police lines and stuff, but without resorting to violence, which is, I think, where it gets really interesting, because Malm then asks, will this being nice strategy actually be enough in the long run? Is it enough to really create change?
That's the million-dollar question, right? He's asking, could the climate movement be, I don't know, too polite, too gentle to get this massive systemic change that's needed? And he uses historical parallels to kind of illustrate this point, right? He brings up the suffragettes.
Oh, yeah, because we tend to think of them, or at least remember them, as these peaceful protesters, right?
Yeah.
But they weren't afraid to get a little, destructive at times.
Exactly.
Smashing a window or even setting fire to a mailbox to make their point heard.
And his argument is that more militant wing, it was crucial, right? Like they wouldn't have achieved what they did, getting the right to vote, without that pressure.
Right, that more radical element, pushing things forward.
And he's careful, he's not condoning violence outright, but he's implying that sometimes a movement needs that sharper edge, something to really shake things up and force those in power to pay attention, to actually listen.
That's a bold statement, to say the least. So he's saying that being too agreeable can backfire away.
Yeah. And he takes it even further, bringing up examples of pipeline sabotage, like the Palestinian resistance way back in the 1930s. They were fighting against, British control of their oil.
Right. And he connects that to what's happening today, like the Houthi rebels in Yemen using drones, right, to attack those Saudi Aramco oil facilities, which totally mess with the global oil supply.
Exactly. Malm uses these examples as a way to show, the impact these actions can have. He's not saying it's always the answer, but he's pushing us to at least consider how effective they can be when it comes to disrupting the fossil fuel industry. And that's public enemy number one in this whole climate crisis.
Yeah, okay, so he's making a case for a more assertive, shall we say, approach to climate activism.
Yeah.
But he doesn't just stop there, does he? He actually gets into specifics about certain tactics, like going after luxury emissions. What's that all about?
It's really interesting. He draws this distinction between luxury emissions versus what he calls subsistence emissions. So basically he says, look, we all have a carbon footprint, but the ultra wealthy, the ones with the private jets and the mega yachts, they're contributing to this crisis at a whole other level.
He gives that example, right? About a single private jet trip emitting more than a person in some countries does in a year.
Yeah. It's crazy, right? And he says those luxury emissions, those should be the first to go. And not just because of the environmental impact, but because it represents this excess, this in your face, I don't care attitude that's fueling our fossil fuel addiction.
So it's symbolic as much as it is practical in a way.
Totally.
And he even suggests some pretty specific ways to target those emissions, right? Like deflating SUV tires in wealthy neighborhoods.
Yep. He talks about his own experience actually being part of a group that did that, deflating tires. His point is, these kinds of actions, they're disruptive, but they make people think, question the cost of this extravagant lifestyle.
Gets the conversation going, that's for sure. But I do wonder about the other side of that. I mean, there's always the risk of backlash. Does he talk about that at all?
He does. Malm acknowledges that this, more confrontational approach could turn people off, maybe even lead to harsher crackdowns from governments. But he's also saying, look, the climate crisis is so serious, the stakes are so incredibly high, we got to be willing to take some risks, some calculated risks.
So it's about weighing the consequences of not acting, of staying silent, against the potential risks of pushing the boundaries.
Exactly. He seems to be saying that at this point, doing nothing is a far scarier prospect than anything that might happen as a result of, shaking things up a bit.
We're talking about some heavy stuff here. Really challenging what's considered okay when it comes to activism. And it gets even trickier when he starts comparing his ideas to, like, icons of nonviolence, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr.
Right.
He's not saying they were wrong, is he?
It's not that, not quite. It's more like he's kind of peeling back the layers a bit on how these movements are often portrayed, like as perfectly peaceful and all that. He brings up examples where violence did happen, like within these movements or even like alongside them, and how those actions might have actually indirectly helped them succeed in the end.
So he's saying we tend to, sanitize history a little to fit this narrative that change only happens through purely peaceful means.
Yeah, exactly. And he even questions whether, like, a group like Extinction Rebellion, even with their, dedication to nonviolence, if they would gotten as much attention, without this underlying, possibility of things escalating.
That's interesting. It's like the fear of what could happen. That's what actually pushes those in power to negotiate with the more moderate groups.
It's a really interesting theory and one that's definitely going to ruffle some feathers. And he kind of backs it up by, looking closely at the strategies of groups like Extinction Rebellion, and he criticizes them, he calls them out on some things.
Oh yeah, he does. He wasn't a fan of them disrupting public transportation.
Right. I gotta admit, even I was kind of confused by that.
Yeah. It seems a little, counterproductive. You're targeting something that's actually part of the solution, right?
It's like, you're trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Yeah.
Malm argues that these actions actually risk alienating, potential allies.
Yeah.
Especially people who rely on public transportation and maybe can't afford to just, switch to a car or something.
It's like they're shooting themselves in the foot, almost.
Yeah.
If you want to build a bigger movement, you don't want to turn away the people you're trying to reach, right?
Exactly. Malm says the movement needs to be smarter, more strategic about its targets. He makes this comparison, kind of a surprising one, to the anti-war movement during Vietnam. He suggests that the climate movement might need its own version of the weather underground.
Whoa, okay. That's a pretty loaded comparison. For those of us who aren't history buffs, who are we talking about here?
So the Weather Underground, they were this radical group that came out of the anti-war movement back in the late 60s. And they were known for bombings, not targeting people, but buildings,
Yeah.
Empty buildings, symbols of the government and corporations that they saw as being complicit in the war.
So is Mom saying that the climate movement needs a radical wing that's willing to use those same tactics? Bombings and stuff.
Not exactly. It's more nuanced than that. He's not advocating for violence, especially not against people. His point is more about disruption, actions that really shake things up that can't be ignored.
So it's about upping the ante, making those in power really uncomfortable.
Right, exactly. And he's very clear that any action at all, should be well thought out, He uses the example of Jessica Resnicek and Ruby Montoya, who sabotaged the Dakota Access Pipeline as an example of this kind of strategic action. You know?
Those are the activists who are facing those incredibly long prison sentences, right? Decades.
Yeah, it's a lot. But Malm points out that they were committed to nonviolence, that they didn't target anyone, and that they were willing to accept the consequences of what they did.
So it's about choosing your targets carefully, understanding the risks, and being accountable for your actions.
Exactly. And he also circles back to this idea of diversity within the movement. He says that just relying on one approach, whether it's huge protests or more targeted actions, that's not going to be enough.
So these different approaches, they can actually work together. Each one kind of creates space for the others to be effective.
Like different pieces of a puzzle.
Yeah.
And it's not even just about the tactics themselves, It's about the message, what you're trying to say. Malm, he talks about how the climate movement, it needs to move beyond, just talking about emissions and polar bears.
Right. It needs to connect with people on a deeper level.
Yeah, connect it to things like social justice, economic inequality, the idea of a livable future for everyone.
Make it personal. Make it clear that this isn't just about, saving the planet in some abstract way, but about protecting people's lives right now.
Exactly. And he's saying that that message, it becomes even stronger, more powerful when it's paired with bold action.
And he even goes there, like philosophically, right? He's got a whole chapter about the ethics of property destruction. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it's a tough conversation to have, one that people shy away from, but Malm, he just dives right in. He makes this argument that while property destruction is like technically a form of violence, it's fundamentally different from violence against people.
Because, well, buildings don't feel pain, right?
Exactly. And he says that the morality of destroying property, it really comes down to what you're targeting and why. Like, he uses this example of destroying a luxury yacht versus destroying, a farmer's field. Those are two very different things, morally speaking.
Yeah, it's a good point. You can't just lump all property destruction into one category. And then he connects it back to the climate movement, right?
Right.
By saying that in some cases it could actually be justified.
Right. He says that if the goal is to, disrupt the fossil fuel industry to prevent even worse ecological collapse, then targeting their infrastructure, their machines, could be seen as a form of, self-defense.
So it's about weighing the potential harm of, say, blowing up a pipeline against the potential harm of letting that pipeline keep operating, letting it contribute to climate change.
Exactly. That's the core of his argument. And he's not saying it's an easy decision to make. He recognizes the risks, the potential for things to backfire, but he also wants us to consider the alternative, which is, continuing down this road we're on, this road to climate catastrophe.
It's heavy stuff, for sure. But he doesn't just stop at these big philosophical questions. He also gets into the psychological effects of all this, right? How climate change messes with our minds.
Yeah.
Both individually and as a movement.
And that's where you really see his personal experience come through in the book.
Yeah.
He talks about his own struggles with despair, even comparing the climate crisis to his time serving in the Iraq War.
Yeah.
Which is wow.
He actually uses the phrase unmitigated disasters to describe both.
Yeah, it's intense. But even amidst all that darkness, he manages to find some hope.
He does.
He even compares hope to an axe you break down doors with in an emergency.
What?
It's such a striking image, right? Hope isn't passive. It's not just wishful thinking. It's this active force that drives us to act, even when things seem impossible.
I love that. So it's hope itself can be a form of resistance.
Totally. But he also acknowledges the other side of that, the despair, the what's the point feeling, which we've all felt, I think. He talks about how that hopelessness can be seductive, especially when we're constantly bombarded with images of, melting glaciers and all that. He argues that those in power, they actually want us to feel hopeless because it's easier to control people who've given up.
So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If we think we're doomed, then why bother fighting?
Exactly. And Malm pushes back against that hard. He says that every action we take, no matter how small, to reduce emissions, it matters. But he's not just talking about, individual actions like changing your light bulbs or whatever. He's talking about collective action, building a movement that can challenge the systems that got us into this mess in the first place.
It's about changing the rules of the game,
right?
Not just playing by the rules we've been given.
Exactly. He wants to see a radical transformation of our economic and political systems, a move away from this obsession with endless growth and towards something more just, more sustainable.
That's a tall order, to say the least. But he seems to think it's possible.
Yeah.
That it starts with simply believing that change is possible.
Right. And that belief, that hope, it's not something we just find lying around. It's something we cultivate through action, through struggle, through fighting for that better future, even when it seems impossible.
So the act of resistance itself can be a source of hope. That's powerful.
It is. And it speaks to this idea that he keeps coming back to. This isn't just about saving the planet. It's about saving ourselves. It's about taking back our power to shape the future.
This is heavy stuff, even for a deep dive. It's clear Malm's not afraid to, poke the bear a little bit, ask the hard questions. But he's not just tearing things down.
Yeah.
He does offer some kind of path forward, even if it's a little, bumpy.
For sure. And in the last part of the book, he gets really into the weeds about what that path might actually look like. How would a more, militant climate movement actually function? What would it do? And how would it deal with all the challenges, pushback from governments, public opinion, all of that?
Okay, so we've talked a lot about, Malm's critiques of the climate movement, those historical comparisons, and even this idea of property destruction as a tactic, which is, whoa, but where do we go from here? Does he give us, a plan?
Yeah.
What's the alternative?
Well, that's the thing about Malm. He's not going to give you like a step-by-step guide to revolution, right? It's more like he wants us to see the cracks in the system, to understand that there are other ways of doing things if we're brave enough to try.
So less of a blueprint, more about like encouraging us to experiment.
Exactly. He gets that there's no one right answer, no magic solution. What works for, say, stopping a pipeline like Canada might be totally different from what's needed to, I don't know, fight deforestation in the Amazon.
Makes sense, yeah. Got to be adaptable, right?
Totally. And that's why he keeps coming back to this diversity of tactics idea. He sees the movement as this like multi-pronged thing, right? Different groups using their own skills, their own advantages to tackle the problem from all sides.
It's like that quote, small x when multiplied by millions of people. Something like that, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Except here, those acts might be a little more intense.
For sure. But the point is, a movement that's got all these different tools in its toolbox, protests, direct action, sabotage, whatever, that's going to be way more effective than one that's just like stuck in one mode.
Keeps them guessing, right?
Exactly. Like he even compares it to the civil rights movement. He talks about how, yeah, the Black Panthers were controversial, obviously, but the pressure they put on the system, it actually created space for, someone like Martin Luther King Jr. to negotiate.
Huh. Like good cop, bad cop, but for social change.
Right. So it's not about picking sides, about being all radical or all moderate. It's about understanding that we need everyone, every approach to really shift the power dynamic.
We need all the tools in the toolbox. Exactly. He wants us to see activism as this like multifaceted thing where the lines between different approaches, they're not always so clear.
One thing I thought was really interesting was his critique of what he calls, what was it? The individualization of responsibility for climate change.
Oh, yeah.
This whole idea that we can solve a systemic problem with individual actions.
It's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Like if we all just recycle more, drive electric cars, everything will be fine.
Right, exactly.
Malm's point is that lets the real bad guys off the hook. The fossil fuel companies, the governments that support them, they're the problem.
It's like blaming the passengers on the Titanic instead of, the captain who hit the iceberg in the first place.
Exactly. And look, he's not saying individual actions don't matter at all. It's just they can only go so far if the system itself is broken. Right?
So it's about changing the system, not just our own habits.
100%. He wants to see the climate movement go beyond, like just asking for little tweaks here and there. He's talking about fundamentally changing how things work, going after the root cause, not just the symptoms.
Okay, yeah, I'm with him there. And he talks a lot about, like, connecting with other movements too, right? Social justice, those kinds of things.
Absolutely. He's big on building a movement that's based on solidarity because, let's face it, the climate crisis, it doesn't exist in isolation, right? It's tied up with economic inequality, racial injustice, colonialism, all of it.
So we're talking about a movement that's not just about, like, saving polar bears. It's about creating a better world for everyone.
Exactly. It's about realizing that we're all connected and that a truly sustainable future means changing our values, our priorities, how we organize society itself. Big stuff.
Like a pretty radical vision, but honestly kind of inspiring too. It's like he's giving us a glimpse of a different way of being,
I think that's the power of this book, honestly. It's not just complaining about how bad things are. It's a call to action. He wants us to imagine something better and then go out and fight for it with everything we've got.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. But hey, that's what a deep dive is all about, right? Getting into the nitty-gritty and coming out the other side, hopefully, with a little more understanding.
Totally. Malm's book, it reminds us that the future isn't like set in stone. We can change things if we're brave enough to question what we think we know and to stand up for the world we want to live in.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into How to Blow Up a Pipeline, a book that definitely gives you a lot to think about, maybe even inspires you to, take action.
One last thought for you. If Malm's right and we need a more, let's say, hands-on approach to climate activism, what role are you going to play?